Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. I think there's some administrative announcements.
That's at the end.
Oh, that's at the end. Oh, okay.
I think one. We are not going to take direct questions. There's the URL, and you guys have to text your questions, and I'll be picking them up as they come up here.
Okay, so welcome, everybody, to this very interesting, what I think will be a very interesting hard talk session with Professor Jean-Paul Faguet from the London School of Economics, who has had a distinguished career in on the topic of decentralization, which is obviously central to a lot of our work here at the World Bank. By the way, I'm Shanta Devarajan. I'm the chief economist of the MENA region here at the bank. And I have to begin by confessing that I used to be Jean-Paul's professor, so we've known each other for about 25 years. But when I was his professor, he used to give me a hard time, so I think this is my chance to retaliate. Okay. Jean-Paul, let's just start with just a simple question. As I said, I've known you a long time, and for about 20 of the 25 years I've known you, you've been talking a lot about decentralization. So why did you get interested in this?
Sure. Thank you, Shanta. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here, and to the bank for inviting me. I'm completely intimidated at being interviewed in this format by Shanta. Because he knows me very well, and so he's going to give me a very hard time. I became interested in this when I was working for the World Bank for 3 years before going back to do my PhD in Bolivia, in the resident mission in Bolivia. And as I was leaving Bolivia, I was going off to the LSE to do my PhD. You know, that die was cast. And the president at the time, Goni Sanchez Lozada, introduced what he called a popular participation program as one of his key reforms of his incoming administration. And all of us inside the bank sort of chuckled and said, oh, great, they're legislating participation. This is ridiculous. And it took me, as the person who should have known what was going on, the frontline person in charge of health, education, and early childhood development programs, a few weeks to realize this was a broad decentralization program. And I had come to know the country reasonably well through the opportunity with the bank of traveling around 1 week every month. And I thought this is going to be really, really interesting. It's going to fundamentally change things. Before that, I had no particular interest in or knowledge of decentralization, but the idea of what it would do to Bolivia then completely changed my idea of what my PhD would be about. It would have been about endogenous growth models, and instead it became about decentralization. And as I saw the reform really sort of permeate the society and the political economy of that very poor country, it sort of gripped me and pulled me deeper and deeper into it.
No, it's very interesting. So now I think we have an idea of why you got interested in decentralization. Why did the Bolivians get interested in decentralization?
That's an interesting question that no one has really been able to answer. There are lots of people, including, I'm embarrassed to say, colleagues in academia who write papers that I occasionally am asked to referee that say it was all an imposition of the evil World Bank and IMF, who sort of thrust decentralization down their throats. And let me tell you, as I just mentioned a moment ago, that is absolutely untrue. So untrue is it that when they announced this popular participation program, we were completely clueless, beginning with me, because I should have been the person who knew what was going on. I had no idea. And so we made those unfunny jokes, you know, in the corridors of the bank office about how, you know, next they'll legislate happiness and then we can all turn out the lights and go home. This will be the perfect country. So it really came from within. I spent 3 days in Washington, in a different bit of Washington, interviewing Goni Sanchez Lozada a couple of years ago, so well after that period. And he'd had time to reflect. And I asked him, you know, why did you do it? Why did you do it? This is like the black hole in the whole decentralization debate about why would any politician who has spent a career, often a lifetime, climbing the greasy pole of power and finally achieves power, is president or prime minister, why does he or she then turn around and decentralize power and resources to people they can't control, to elected local mayors and governments that they can't control by design? If they're really doing it sincerely, then these people have their own mandates. And nobody can answer that question. If you think presidents and prime ministers are rational actors, then why would they give away things they don't need to give away? In the Bolivians' case, there was a long-standing cleavage, a regional cleavage within the country that created systematic problems for anybody who was present in that country. In particular, Santa Cruz and Tarija threatened to secede. They threatened violence. They actually executed violence in the streets, as in protests that became violent and people died. And they were threatening to break up the country, and in the case of Santa Cruz, to join Brazil or to just become independent. And Santa Cruz is the richest place in Bolivia where most of the gas and oil resources were. And Goni Sanchez de Lozada said to me, and I believe this is true, he said, I knew I had to do something about that. I had to pull the rug out from under the feet of the powerful business elites who ran that sort of program, that agenda. And the way to do that was to decentralize down beneath them to a lower level, which were the municipalities. So he had, and it's my view, after spending a long time thinking about this, that nobody, there may be philosopher kings out there. Maybe Goni Sanchez Lozada is a philosopher king and wanted what was good for his country and his people. And that may be true. I don't want to be overly cynical. But that's not what drives decentralization. What drives decentralization is that it is seen as a solution to a short-term political problem. And in this case, it was the inability to rule unless you could deal with these elites that, in the medium to long term, actually threatened the breakup of the country.
So that's very interesting. That the impetus was really a political game that was being played, and Goni Sanchez wanted to be smarter than his opponents at this. But that's very interesting because our general view of decentralization, as you said, the academic literature always talks about the economic benefits, the efficiency gains and the greater accountability and so on. So why do you think that? And in your very nice book, by the way, this is a great book, an award-winning book on decentralization and popular democracy in Bolivia. You show that there were some benefits of that would be predicted by the sort of standard economic models coming out of this. So first of all, maybe you could describe a little bit what those benefits were. But secondly, how do you reconcile that with the fact that the impetus was political?
Yeah, okay. So quickly, some of the benefits that you saw empirically coming out of decentralization in Bolivia is that there's a huge change in resource flows and public investment flows away from infrastructure and especially economic activity, straightforward, mining, hydrocarbons, electricity generation, towards human capital formation and primary services. Excuse me. So a big switch in resource flows away from those sectors I mentioned towards health, education, water and sanitation in particular. And more importantly and more interestingly, because that sort of mixed up with other things that were going on in Bolivia at the time in terms of economic reform, they privatized the big hydrocarbons, state monopolies, and so on. But more interestingly, and this I think is certainly due to decentralization and not anything else, you see that investment became much more sensitive to real measures of local need. So education investment went up across the country, but it went up disproportionately in smaller, poor, more rural places where fewer people could read. So you see a pro-needs kind of criterion. Places that had worse education indicators invested even more in education. Similarly, or in parallel, places with really bad water and sanitation indicators in terms of poor access, poor quality service, poor quality water, invested even more in water and sanitation than the mean, likewise for health. So what the impetus was political, and I think the genius of Bolivian decentralization, and I do think it was broadly speaking, everything is messy and complicated, and it's not the case that everything was wonderful, but broadly speaking, Bolivia was a success story, and it was a success story because they decentralized politically for real, in the sense of passing down not just resources to lower levels of administration, but real political power and discretion. And they let those people get on with it. And there were many individual, the 327 municipalities in Bolivia, there were dozens or scores of municipal failures where the money was wasted or it was misspent or they just got unlucky and the projects didn't work out. But there were many more successes at the local level. And so in the aggregate, at the national level, more successes and failures means overall a successful program. But it's because those mayors and municipal governments were elected and were held to account to their voters. And that really happened. It wasn't just that the central government continued pulling the strings, as I think happens in many, if not most countries.
let's come back to the politics in a minute, but I think maybe it's important for everyone to be on the same page as to what we mean by this decentralization. I mean, as I understand it, they devolved devolved resources for investment purposes. So the municipalities could decide whether to invest in schools or to invest in bridges or roads and so on. But some of the current expenditures were still controlled at the central level. Is that right? Like, for instance, the teacher salaries or the doctor salaries and so on. Is it
correct? Yep.
Okay. So it's what in another era I used to call partial decentralization, right? Because so how did that? Well, okay. So if we're agreed on that was what was devolved, and then you say this is addressing local needs, it's true. There's a local need. If you have high levels of illiteracy, there's a need for schools. But really, I mean, there's quite a lot of evidence that schools don't generate literacy. You need teachers, and you need the teachers to show up, and so on. And now those teachers were still being controlled by the central government. So in what sense do we think this actually worked?
And when I say it worked, I mean in terms of the closest that we can get to final outcome indicators. So more schools were built, more schools were staffed, and more kids went to school. Unfortunately for Bolivia, there just isn't the amount and quality of data that you can then try to map that onto real learning outcomes in the sense of test scores or real health measures of outcomes. You can do that for Colombia, which I've also worked on. And in Colombia, because Colombia is just a more sophisticated country with better data, and in Colombia you can clearly show that decentralization is directly related to a big boost in terms of children enrolling in school and better health outcomes, better access to subsidized health provision, and so on and so forth. So the real outcomes, that data is clear there. Oh, okay. So the central, right? That happened in. It's important to. A huge amount of the academic literature is oversimplified. And I think the debate is oversimplified in the sense that we think in terms of is decentralization good or bad, and we think in terms of central versus decentralized governments as if they were polar opposites and somehow mirror images of one another, and that's just not the case. So I know that we're used to talk about partial decentralization. I think you can continue talking about partial, not least because I teach that stuff. So, decentralization is not a move away from central government control towards exclusive control, financing, and discretion of local governments. What it is a huge complexification, if I can make that word up, of fiscal relations and discretion. And by that I mean the following. If you think about a highly centralized system of government, what you mean is the centralized ministries in the capital take the decisions, and those decisions filter down to local officials who are part of a chain of command that respond back to their ministers. So education policy is made in La Paz, let's say, and the local person implementing in a village, if there is one there, is part of a hierarchy that reaches back up to the Minister of Education. When you decentralize, what you do is to make that much more complex, and you create new local authorities with a mandate if you democratically decentralize. So we're not talking about deconcentration or delegation or the other things that fill the taxonomy of academia, but a real democratic decentralization. Then you have locally elected authorities who have their own mandates, but they don't take all of the decisions and finance everything locally. What they have to do is work with meso-level and central-level authorities to produce services in a way that's more complex in a political economy sense and in an administrative sense. But they have key inputs and their own resources that they contribute to this.
But help me out here, Jean-Paul. You described earlier Bolivian politics before the decentralization was the typical sort of patronage politics, the different ethnic groups lobbying for their own power, and all of that we just see in lots of other countries. And then somehow you're painting a picture that when you decentralize, that seems to disappear at the local level. That somehow the local level politicians are suddenly fully accountable to their constituency. How did this miracle happen? You have patronage politics all up and down the system, and now there are many more people, there are many more patrons, and there are many more clients. When you have patronage, so
in other pieces of work, I've described the Bolivian system beforehand, and any country that's highly centralized in a democratic system as being oligopolized, basically, where you have a small number of people who live typically in the capital and a few other big cities who control the political parties and who control the patronage networks, and they're the ones who take decisions and they're the ones who benefit. When Goni announced this, when the President Sanchez Lozada announced this program back in 1994, he said, if this fails utterly and does nothing more than generalized corruption, where 50 people have their hands in the pot now, maybe 50,000 people will have their hands in the pot in the future, that's a benefit and that's the country marching forward, because at the very least will create sort of broader economic circulation throughout the country, in the countryside, which is... So the people...
Do you believe that? I mean, do you agree with that statement, that that's an improvement? If you decentralize corruption?
I don't think that's what happened in Bolivia. I think more than that happened. I mean, that did happen in some cases. Yeah, I think so. I think as between 50 people having access to power, control, and resources, and a much larger number, then the latter is better. Go on.
Well, the reason I ask is because there is research and some studies like the stuff that Bardhan and Mukherjee get up to, which says that in India, for instance, the possibility of elite capture, is greater at the subnational level. That the federal government is the one that actually tries to be somewhat equitable, but when you get down to it, the local landlords, the local chieftains are much more powerful. So in which case, you could actually make things worse by decentralization.
What decentralization ended up doing in Bolivia, and I think what it will tend to do when it's done democratically, is to increase transparency hugely. And so that initial corruption shock where you generalize corruption, if that is indeed what happens in any country, and instead of 50 people, you have 50,000 people, generates its own endogenous dynamic for its own end, in the sense that if you have 50,000 people with their hands in the till, it's much more difficult to hide that from the electorate, who is meant to be benefiting from the public resources that are being devolved down to all those municipalities. Whereas 50 people in the capital are very, very distant from the vast majority of their fellow citizens, and they can hide it, right?
Yeah, although there is a counter-argument there, which is often invoked. I'm not saying that there isn't a self-interest here, which is that the people at the local level have less capacity.
Yeah.
Right. And therefore, it is actually more likely that the stuff will get stolen, because it's harder from a purely sort of financial management point of view of tracking these funds, whereas the federal government or the central government has a long experience and has the capacity. You've got civil servants who've been doing this for years. So how does that reconcile with this greater transparency that comes with decentralization?
The curious thing that I've seen in Bolivia, and my feeling is, my position is this is a general kind of observation, although I can't prove that academically in any way, is that low capacity also maps onto low need. So you have low capacity in places where you have high poverty and where needs are great. And so in those places, the kinds of interventions you need are fairly simplistic. In places where, as in many towns and villages throughout Bolivia, 20 years ago, what many people can't read, what you need is more schools. Well, building a school isn't that difficult. It's not like building fancy R&D facilities or building, expensive, complex bridges or highways. That's more difficult, but those places aren't at that level of development. And the people who live in these places can build a school because they all live in houses, and the school looks kind of like a house with, somewhat different parameters. And what you see in Bolivia is a huge boost. So there are 3 or 4 separate periods after decentralization, and you see this very clearly when you look through the data. It's just the periods pop out at you in the fiscal and investment data. And what you see is a huge boost in urban investment and in education, bigger in education than urban investment. And then education starts to come down, and you see other sectors coming up like water and sanitation and health. And again, after traveling around and thinking about this for a while, it seems to me like there's organizational learning going on through the decades in Bolivia, or through these sequential 5-year periods, where municipalities cut their teeth, municipalities that have never managed any money, that have never managed contracts, that have never they didn't even legally exist. Right? So 2/3 of Bolivian municipalities were not legally incorporated. If there was a mayor, it was, the old man in the town who was a ceremonial mayor who presided over the village festival once per year, but he had no salary, no staff, no offices, no nothing. Because legally that place didn't exist. So they got incorporated, and they set off investing in some of their highest priorities, which were also amongst their highest priorities. I mean, how do we compare education, water, and health? I'm not going to try. But if they need all of these things, they begin with education, and this makes sense because it's easier to build primary schools than it is to build water and sanitation systems. And in doing this, they cut their teeth on things like budgeting, contracting, managing contracting firms, etc. And then they apply those skills 5 years later to something that's more difficult, like building a hospital or a health post, or starting to build standpipes, water standpipes. And then they get, they move on and they start investing in transport and agricultural extension, irrigation schemes, and things that are more and more complex. And I think what this shows, I can't prove it, but anecdotally I've seen it in some case studies. Nationwide I can't prove it, but it seems to me that fairly obvious that this is organizational learning, and this is people getting more sophisticated. And you see on the corruption issue, you see citizens holding their leaders to account more vigorously and sometimes quite shockingly. So there are municipalities 5 and 6 years out where it's discovered, little tiny villages and towns on the Altiplano, where it's discovered that the mayor has been stealing all the, why is his house bigger and why does he own 2 4-wheel drive vehicles where no one else in the village owns any vehicle? Because he's stealing the money. What do? They take him out and they burn him alive. The citizens do this. Now, I also don't endorse that, but, the next mayor didn't do that. Right? The next mayor did not buy himself a 4-wheel drive vehicle. And other mayors around in that region, everyone knew about this. So.
But let's come back to this capacity question, and there's a question from cyberspace here on that, which is if, as you said, these municipalities had no experience with financial management, and so you were actually giving them power and they had to learn on the job. And you were taking power away from people who had lots of experience with financial management. So in many cases, what you find is that in the initial stages of decentralization, you could actually see a decline in the quality of services because you're moving it from people who knew what they were doing to people who knew less of what they were doing, even though, as you were saying, they can improve. Now, the question is, how do you differentiate between a situation like that, where there's a decline in the quality of services, but it might get better, to one where it's just a decline in quality of services that are going to stay bad?
There are 2 different things going on. One is that the people who might have more knowledge about how to deliver services and how to manage budgets and all of that sort of thing, are also now in a centralized system going to tend to be practiced in the art of public investment distortion, of stealing, of favoritism, of obeying the political commands of their higher ups, and so on and so forth. So that knowledge is a 2-edged sword. And secondly, the people who don't have the knowledge, who are coming in, who are picking up public investment from the local level, are going to build up that sort of knowledge, hopefully quickly, but also they should have more accountability because the pots are smaller and they're distributed throughout the country, and people in the village can see if the mayor suddenly has 2 4-wheel drive vehicles or not. They can see if the school is being built or not, and they have someone to complain to. Before, under centralization, the money simply didn't reach the villages, and the people in the villages had no one to complain to. They had no one who would respond to them. They had to get on a bus and then get on another bus and spend days in most of Bolivia traveling to the central government to try to get the audience of who? Of the minister, of some senior official in the ministry who would never meet with them. Now they go marching across the town square and they beat on the door of the mayor and they say, we demand our school. I've seen this all the time. Part of what made Bolivian decentralization a success is that it was very simple. So it was a simple per capita criterion where they decentralized in the first year 155 Bolivianos per capita to every municipality. And it was a strict, straightforward, no complex poverty equation or formula or anything else that was weighted in any way. It was just per capita, which, as we know, we economists and social scientists know that this is unfair in a number of ways, but it has the enormous benefit of being simple, and people who are semi-literate can understand it. And so in municipalities that have different towns and villages, people from village C would turn up in the mayor's office and pound on the door and say, we have 50 families who live there. That means 300 people. That means so many Bolivianos that you have received on our account, and we want our school. And we're not going to leave your office. We're going to occupy your office, and we're not going to leave until you sign the order to build us a school, because our children have nowhere to learn. So there's less technical knowledge and less expertise, which is a double-edged sword. There's less knowledge about how to distort things also. But there should be much more transparency. And it seems to me that these two things will roughly balance each other up within the technical. And if the technical knowledge can be built up quickly, then in the medium term, it should be better.
That's an interesting point, that there may be a trade-off between transparency and technical expertise. But there's a question here whether there's any evidence that the quality of services improved. This was the question I asked earlier about whether test scores and so on, rather than just more infrastructure. But let me put a little twist to that, because it could be, as we observe in many countries, that the real political capture goes on in the service delivery side. That the teachers' unions are so powerful that they are able to have a 25% absentee rates of teachers in public schools and get away with it, because they're the ones who run the electoral campaign for the mayor. And the mayor doesn't have to be held accountable for that, because he says, well, the teachers are all central government employees. I can't do anything about it. So could this be just a complete ruse concocted by the Bolivians to protect the rents of the teachers and the medical unions and all of the public sector workers who really matter and are really very powerful, and give up, let the infrastructure, let the municipalities do the infrastructure?
Yeah, I'm quite sure that wasn't the case in Bolivia, not least because the teachers were the main organizing force, organizing enormous protests against what they call la ley maldita, the damned law of decentralization, of popular participation, immediately after its announcement. They were completely against it, but it could operate that way anyway. So I take your point, that it could operate that way in Bolivia and even worse in other countries. Curiously, and again, this is sort of anecdotal evidence. I can't say anything terribly systematic about it, but increasingly over time, municipalities build schools that the central administration won't finance line items for teachers, and so then they just hire their own teachers, and they hire them outside the centralized escalafon, the centralized teacher hierarchy and the wage system, etc. They just hire their own teachers to man the schools until the state eventually allocates some teaching for them. So, I mean, it could be the case that kind of thing is going on, but my sense is that there's more accountability across all of these primary social services, because there's more transparency, because the authorities responsible, the mayors and the municipal councils really feel responsible for the state of the schools and hospitals, and that seems to be trumping. Let me put it another way. In Bolivia, under centralization, the education ministry was completely captured by the teachers' union, right? My sense now is that that's less the case, and even if it's as much the case as it was back then, the schools are operating more days of the week, and the teachers, with higher probability, the teachers live in the town or village or closer to the town and village. They're not commuting from the state capital. So I think, I can't prove it because the data's not there, but it seems to me like education's gotten better, and the same is true for water and health.
But let me give you an example from Nigeria,
Okay.
Where decentralization may have reduced accountability. Because, as you know, Nigeria has high levels of corruption all over. And when they decentralized to the third tier, and we knew that the deconcentrated agents in the third tier were stealing the money all the time. But when they decentralized and said now the districts were responsible for health spending and so on, then when the money was missing, when the clinic had no equipment and things like that, the local mayor would say the money never came from the central government. So now he had an excuse for, even if the money did come and he stole it, he could now plausibly say, well, you know, this government is so slow in getting the money. That's why I don't have any. So we've actually given them another reason not to be accountable. So we've actually undermined their accountability.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've heard that sort of argument now when I've gone back to Bolivia in my field work almost 20 years later. Mayors love doing that, and it gives them, an easy pass. What can I say? Under centralization in Bolivia, central government freely chose in an unconstrained way, because they had all power and resources in their hands. They made the laws. They could do anything they wanted. Most other municipalities didn't exist in any legal sense. Governors were nominated by the president. They were not elected. So there was no countervailing power or pressure. They could take whatever decision they wanted, and the central government freely chose year in and year out for the 7 years before decentralization to invest nothing in 85% of Bolivian municipalities. And by nothing, I mean 0.000, absolutely nothing. They financed teacher salaries, but there was no incremental investment in any schools, in any teaching materials, etc. So this is going on. What you described is going on in Bolivia right now, but it still represents a huge improvement from the situation ex ante. The other thing to say is, I end up coming across as a decentralization true believer. And let me be clear, I am a decentralization true believer, but not in some sort of religious or prophetic sense. Because again, after thinking about this for a very long time, I believe in it, but I don't think that it's a panacea or it's always going to work out well. I believe in it in a similar way to my belief in democracy. And my belief in democracy admits that there are countries like Nigeria, which are not such great democracies. But I don't look at Nigeria and say, oh, Nigeria and Sweden, oh, well, the evidence is mixed, so we can't say anything about democracy. No, I think it's a good way forward, but you need to work very hard to make it work properly and to improve any democracy, including the Swedish democracy. You have to be eternally vigilant to make sure it works well. And I think the same is true of decentralization. It's not like a switch you flip that will somehow make things better automatically. But it should do. There are good reasons for thinking that it will do some important things that have to do with transparency and accountability. But it's a long road, and you never get there. You have to always sort of fight and work to make these things, to try to make these things happen.
Okay, there's a question that came from the wires that I can't resist. And I'll read it. I'm reading it verbatim now. You said decentralization responds to the needs of the people. What if demand doesn't increase so that people continue to prefer open defecation? I should warn you, there are several experts in open defecation in this room. So, technical experts.
One of the wonderful things about working on decentralization is that it forces me to learn a lot about health, education, water and sanitation, transport, agriculture, things that I otherwise can profess no expertise in. So the first thing is that I know nothing about open defecation, and I'm not an expert in water and sanitation generally. Along the lines of what we were saying before, that when you decentralize, a proper decentralization system is not one that moves from one polar extreme to another, but one that makes fiscal and political relations and administrative relations far more complex. It's a complexification of service delivery. One of the things that it should do is bring together different types of knowledge, because the production of any service doesn't rely only on technical expertise or only on local, what Elinor Ostrom calls local time and place knowledge. You have to bring the two together, right? And in different sorts of services, there are different mixes of these kinds of knowledge. So for education, there's some very important technical expertise, but the local time and place knowledge is relatively more important than for something like higher tier health services, where the straightforward technical expertise is just more important, right? Where you put the school on one side or the other of a river or a road or a mountain ridge will crucially affect the number of children who go there, all through the agricultural cycle and all through the year. You will tend to put a higher level hospital in a particular place as according to broader criteria, not just where the stream is or where the mountain ridge is. And the good provision of services depends much more on medical, epidemiological, and other kinds of knowledge than local time and place knowledge, right? So what decentralization should do is bring these two things together. And if open defecation is a bad thing, and I presume that's what's behind this question, then the technical experts should have the leeway in in a properly decentralized system to set up incentives such that the people stop doing that, such that the kinds of infrastructure that you need and the kinds of education programs that need to be provided get provided anyway, despite the fact that people don't want it. But then when they get public bathroom facilities, the people will have some input into where they should go. That shouldn't be decided in La Paz or Delhi or Beijing.
Well, I think there's another aspect to open defecation or sanitation, which is that it's a public good. So the effect of open defecation is that it ruins the soil quality and the water quality, and people, children get diseases and so on. Not the person who's actually practicing it, but the neighbors. And this brings me to another point, because the old Musgrave-Oates theory of decentralization, which I probably taught you, says that you decentralize to the subsidiarity principle. You decentralize to the level where the public good is internalized to the community. Now, what Bolivia did wasn't exactly aligned to this. Right, because they, as you said, they decentralized investment and didn't decentralize operating expenses or O&M. And you would almost say that the public versus the broader public good versus the narrow public good would be the reverse, that most investments are the ones that have spillover effects. And teachers going to school are much more of a local good. So how is it that, having defied the standard economic principles, you still seem to show that the decentralization works? So it went exactly opposite to the Musgrave-Oates principle, and yet it seemed to have done the right thing, or delivered the goods.
Yeah, no, you're right. The Bolivians didn't do it according to the classic principles. The classic principles are wonderful in theory, and they work less well in practice because there are almost no two services that have similar spillover and economy of scale characteristics, just to pick those two criteria. So the optimal administrative unit to run primary education is almost certainly not the same optimal administrative unit to run primary health care, let alone agricultural, irrigation or agricultural extension or transport policy. But in practice, we can't have 500 different administrative levels, 500 different levels of elected authorities, one for each kind of service. We need to have 2, 3, or 4 levels in any country. In a place like Bolivia, you have 3, which is standard. You've got municipalities, and then you've got departments, which are like states or provinces, and then you've got the national government. And you can imagine a few more, but not very many more. So you're always going to have to make compromises. But my quick answer to your question is sort of an easy opt-out, and that is that I suppose I should apologize for this, but as part of what made Bolivia, I didn't realize this at the time, but I came to realize it later on, as part of what made Bolivia such a brilliant case study, is that the central government before decentralization was so bad and so unresponsive that, you could argue that anything that you did that severely shook up, this black box of central government control and financing would make things better, because they were so bad that they almost couldn't get worse. So when I say that 85% of Bolivian municipalities got no education investment year in and year out for 7 years, and I say 7 because before that there's a crisis, and so the data there's no data basically. That's an astonishing sort of level of insensitivity and poor public investment pattern, etc. So any change from that, maybe you could have done something completely different that would have nothing to do with decentralization, that would also have generated an improvement, although probably a different kind of improvement.
It's an interesting approach or way to look at it. Was that decentralization was a disruption.
Yeah.
You had a deeply dysfunctional system, and the Musgrave-Oates theorems are all about a pristine system where you're trying to make it a little bit better. And here you got a chaotic system, and you disrupt it, and it works. So is that advice you would like to give the teams here, many of whom work in equally dysfunctional systems?
Let's go down to the pub and have a drink, and I'll give you that advice. But I'm not going to do it right here. No, I don't know. I think so. Decentralization is a process. It's a long-winded process, and it's a process of change over time. The starting point, where you are ex ante before you begin to decentralize, is it plays a huge part in the expected outcomes of any decentralization, right? So it's not something that we should expect to behave. It's not a reform that we should expect to have similar outputs regardless of the starting point. Bolivia was deeply dysfunctional, and so it tended to work very well there. If you're Singapore and you're much, much, much smaller, and the public administration is much higher capacity and far more responsive, then decentralization is probably not a good idea. If things are going pretty well, then you probably don't need to change, or you don't need this particular kind of change. It also depends on the objective characteristics. The country big or small, heterogeneous, homogeneous, ethnically, culturally, geographically, and so on and so forth. My guess is that most developing countries are more like Bolivia than like Singapore in the sense of being poor, but also being relatively big and diverse, and having lots of political cleavages and geographic heterogeneity, and so decentralization. And also the legacy of colonialism is that many of these countries are really very highly centralized. And centralization plays into the hands of economic and political elites in the capital who like centralization. I mean, the cynical take on my initial question about Bolivia, why would any rational elected leader do it, is why would any self-interested economic and political elites allow it to happen? They benefit from centralization, right? It's easier to bribe 50 people than to try to find 50,000 and bribe all of them.
No, I mean, I think that's a good point, because it's something we observed, for instance, in Pakistan, where, coming back to the point we were making earlier, that sometimes the quality of services actually declines initially. And that's the point in which the civil servants, whose power was just reduced, the capital city civil servants, said, aha, I told you so. These guys don't know how to run a local government. Why don't we re-centralize? And there was actually discussion about going backwards on that. You have any views on whether we should do that ever?
About re-centralizing?
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, sure. As I said, I'm not sort of religious about this. I think you try it, and if it doesn't work, then re-centralize. And if things were working better before, then go back to the status quo ante, but maybe try it again in some different way. Try to analyze what the problem was. In Pakistan, I've just finished editing a book that has a chapter by Roger Myerson, Ali Chima, and Adnan Khan on decentralization in Pakistan. And what they analyze is that decentralization, unlike many countries where it's been tried, was completely and by design untied. In fact, there were sort of Chinese walls between the decentralization program and the local governments it created and the national political parties. And this was done intentionally by General Musharraf because he wanted to create a non-political base of support for himself. And he had deposed Prime Minister Sharif, and he was opposed by the political parties as a de facto ruler, and so he wanted to undermine them, and so he created a huge level of government, of local government, tens of thousands of elected officials who could not have party affiliation. So what happens when he eventually is forced to step down and the political parties come back? They get rid of it. Well, of course they get rid of it. It was designed against them, against their interests. And this is a point that Roger has been making in several of his writings recently, that in order for decentralization to work, it's not just the point that I stressed a lot in this book on Bolivia about the transparency and the openness of local political party competition, but that has to be articulated upwards to national political parties in order to get the sort of systemic benefits, and in order also to stabilize decentralization so that you don't have an instant sort of backlash against it.
But this comes back to this point that I'm beginning to get discouraged that the theory that we all have been teaching our students may not be even relevant in this decentralization debate. I mean, you have countries like Bolivia, Indonesia, Nigeria that decentralize not according to the Musgrave-Oates principles. There's frequently unclear responsibilities. Some of them have education fully decentralized, some of them only half decentralized, as in the Bolivia case. Some have education but not health, or the other way around, and so on. So should we worry about that? Because this is typically when that happens, we have teams go out there and try to advise them on how doing it right. But maybe we shouldn't worry about that. Maybe it's because it's actually a political move that's being made, like as Musharraf did. Incidentally, the other part of the Musharraf story is that the provincial governors were getting too powerful. It's a little bit like what you were saying about Ghani. And so by devolving to the local governments, he actually undermined the provincial governments. Of course, that's what led to the resistance as well. So maybe we should be thinking about decentralization a very different way from our traditional approach.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. Don't be discouraged, Shanta. The thing is that you have countries like Bolivia and Indonesia, which are so far from any kind of first best outcome. So you put it really nicely, as is your wont. You said that Musgrave and Oates and the sort of the classic public economics theories of decentralization are thinking about relatively, in light of the way the world really works in most developing countries today, relatively modest changes to get to a first best equilibrium. And the countries that we're talking about are so far from that frankly there are lots and lots of changes that they need to make that will make things better, even though they don't look like Musgrave and Oates and that sort of thing. Secondly, it's very curious. I mean, I suppose it's a very, very favorable nod to economists that economists have really led the debate on decentralization for, since Tibu at least, if not longer. Because it is fundamentally not about economics, I think. I think decentralization is fundamentally about the politics of political economy. Because what is it? It's about changing the way a country is governed. When you decentralize, you're changing the relations of public accountability, of political power, and of responsibility. And then this will have economic effects, but the economic effects are really second order, right? In terms of efficiency, of responsiveness of public goods or public investment, of service provision. The first order effect operates through politics, right? That's what it is. It's changing the laws and the constitutions and the relations amongst different, hopefully elected governors.
That leads me to this question that just came through, and I'll read it again.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know is the answer, but let me answer it this way. Decentralization in Bolivia, which was opposed broadly, including by the people who ended up benefiting the most, people like the teachers' unions and others, or let's say the education sector, put it more broadly, as the damned law. Alongside a bunch of other big reforms that Goni Sanchez Lozada was doing at the time, ended up being the one standout reform that not only was not overturned by all of the political changes and all of the upheavals that have happened in Bolivia since then, but have actually been deepened and driven further and expanded. They've rebranded it. Now it's called autonomy and not decentralization or popular participation. But if you look at the law of decentralization, the law of autonomy and decentralization passed recently, and you look at the new constitution passed in 2010, you see very clearly that the Bolivian Republic has gotten far more decentralized and along the lines set up by popular participation. So the 1994 decentralization set up by a dynamic that endogenously led to its own not just survival and strengthening, but its deepening in the sense of more power and more authority devolved down to lower levels of government and then to newly created meso levels in between the municipality and the national government, and also to far more resources going to these places. So there's that sort of favorable dynamic. Now, if the question, it's a great question, if the question is, beginning with a highly centralized regime, how do you set up incentives to decentralize? I can't think of any. Maybe there are some. I can't think of any. There's an interesting parallel with the debate between liberalization and stabilization. Right? If you go back to think about the 1980s and 90s, if a country is in, say, economic freefall, you have hyperinflation, you need to stabilize and you need to do it very rapidly, right? Because if you're Bolivia in the 1980s or Brazil in the 90s, there are people who are benefiting from hyperinflation and from macroeconomic instability. And what you don't want to do, by and large, is announce a gradual plan of stabilization that these people can adapt to and undermine ex ante. You want to stabilize as shock therapy. That's not how you liberalize, right? We know that's not how you liberalize because Argentina, Chile, and other countries tried it, and it completely destroyed their manufacturing sector. You don't tell people making televisions and cars domestically in your protected market, we're going to drop tariff barriers, to 0 or to 5% tomorrow, and you need to adapt really quickly because this is muscular capitalism. Because they do a very simple thing: they go out of business, right? So how does decentralization fit into these polar opposites? It seems to me that decentralization needs to happen as shock therapy because of those political elites in the capital who are benefiting from hyper-centralization. You need to pull the rug out from under them in a way that they're not expecting, and start benefiting a new constituency that then generates its own endogenous sort of incentives, not just to maintain decentralization, but hopefully to deepen it.
Let me get back to this question. You alluded to it earlier about that Bolivia was also in danger of breaking up.
Yeah.
Santa Cruz was going to go with Brazil or something like that, right? Exactly. And you actually mentioned it in the book as well. So here's another debate that goes on, because we have lots of countries that are in danger of breaking up, including Sri Lanka. And there's often a debate whether decentralization keeps the country together or creates the centrifugal forces so that they finally break up. And this came to a head when we were in the national dialogue in Yemen recently. You have any advice?
A little bit. In this book that I mentioned that is just off now to the publisher, we talk about this in a couple of chapters. I'm going to be an economist weenie and say it depends, as of course you would expect it to. But I think we can say systematic things about this. Let's begin with empirical cases. It seems to me there's very little question that Spain is held together as a republic because of its devolution, right? And so the Basques and, more importantly, the Catalans would almost certainly, within the broader umbrella of the EU, have broken away and become their own independent states, but for
they may still do that.
And they may still do that, yeah, absolutely. The Scots are threatening to do it this year in the UK. Without any question whatsoever, the key to the Northern Ireland peace agreement was devolution, right? It was straightforward. The IRA gave up their arms. They put them beyond use. We think they buried them somewhere and poured concrete over them or something like this. So they didn't actually hand them over because the symbolism would have been too stark. They didn't give up their arms to the British government, but they put them beyond use in exchange for devolution of power to Northern Ireland and for their entry as the IRA in the political system. And so the IRA is participating as a political party, as an elected political party in government right now. So those examples, it's just two anecdotal examples, but they're quite stark. If you think about how this works dynamically in any country, so I think, and I'm not an expert on Turkey whatsoever, but I think about Kurds in Turkey, and where it's a distinct group and they tend to live in one part of the country and they're a minority, but geographically it's a non-trivial bit of the country. So how should a government like Turkey deal with the Kurds? Well, they can do what they did for most of their history, which is to repress them, right? Not permit teaching in the Kurdish language, not permit radio broadcasts in the Kurdish language, repress them and teach the Kurdish children, along with all Turkish children, that the Kurds are bad and violent and not properly Turks. And what this does is to create a big constituency of people who don't like Turkey and don't like centralization, right? They don't like the national government. Or you can, but it's not the case that all of these people who harbor these resentments, for strong reasons, are violent separatists. So what you can do is you can take the onion and peel off the outer layers, away from the firebrands, from the people who really want the breakup of the country, who are the sort of the hard nut, if I can mix my metaphors, at the center of this onion, by giving the sorts of autonomy, benefits and concessions to them, give them their own regional government, let them educate their kids in Kurdish, let them have TV and radio broadcasts and publish books and so on and so forth. And then what you do is you peel away people who are just basically ordinary citizens who don't want to feel ashamed about being Kurdish, and you isolate the firebrands from them and you leave them by themselves. If you try to repress them, what you do is to envelop them in a happy group of people that they can lead, right? Because of, sorry, all right, I've already said what I have to say.
This is very interesting because there's a question right along those lines that in countries like Kenya, the motivation for decentralization is to mitigate ethnic divisions.
Yeah.
Right. And so in this one, it's not an it depends. You're saying it's almost always going to help.
I would think so. It depends on how you decentralize, but I mean, if you decentralize along the ways that we've been discussing, it seems to me like overwhelmingly, we should expect it to make the republic stronger and make the nation state stronger by making it more diverse and more flexible, because then you create units that people. The other thing is that you then decentralize to a level beneath the level of the major ethnic cleavage. If we're talking about ethnic or sort of cultural cleavages, then what you don't want, so the counter argument is if you decentralize, you'll create a unit that the Kurds, for example, in Turkey, or a particular group in Kenya will dominate, and they'll be able to show that they run this state or this region well, that they're effective leaders, and they'll eventually break off and become their own country. I'm not convinced that's always a terrible thing, by the way, but it depends very much on the starting point. But it seems to me that if you decentralize to a level beneath that, then you can decentralize to a level like municipalities or local governments that become associated with service provision and not with ethnic pride, right? So you decentralize not to one Kurdish region, but to dozens or hundreds of Kurdish municipalities. And then those Kurdish municipalities are going to be judged as according to how they provide education, health, and water, and not are they flying the flag of Kurdistan. And so this is the way that you can accomplish two really important things with one reform.
When you said sometimes it might be not such a bad thing, I was reminded of an anecdote with my colleague Junaid Ahmed, who was giving a talk to the National Dialogue in Yemen about exactly this point, that how by decentralizing you can actually hold the union together. And, you know, with Yemen, they used to be separate, North and South Yemen, and now they come together, but there are some centrifugal forces. And one person in the audience put up his hand and said, "You're a Bangladeshi, right? Did you benefit from secession?" And Junaid was silenced. So be careful. But there's another question that came in that reminded me that I wanted to come back to this, again, back to the standard theory, but with the experience that one of the other aspects of decentralization that has gotten in the way is that some of these local governments have then run large deficits and debt, in the Brazil case. And then, and if you're too big to fail, you have every incentive to run up huge debts, just like some U.S. financial institutions. How do you how do you avoid that? What can you do to protect excess spending by local governments once they decentralize?
No, that's hugely important. The quick answer is you need a no bailout clause, and it needs to be credible and it needs to be acted on. You have this in American history, actually, where states were bailed out, and then at some point, I can't remember the date exactly, but in fact, there's a book that came out of the World Bank by Gunnar Eskeland and a couple of other people, and Junaid, that's right, that analyze this in economic history terms. If we update to the very recent past, you see this in Argentina. The broad, I'm sure not in this room, but the broad popular view is that what caused the economic debacle in Argentina around 2000, 2001 was that the Argentine peso was pegged to the dollar, and that's without any doubt part of the story. But actually, the main driver of macroeconomic instability and the blow up there was subnational, provincial deficits, which were just spiraling out of control. And the political, through politics, through the coalition in Congress, the political necessity of serially bailing out, especially the smaller, poor, more profligate provinces in Argentina, which then led the national deficit. The structural deficit at the national level wasn't actually that bad, but when they absorbed all of the subnational deficits, then the situation became unmanageable, and they very quickly got into printing money to cover the province's deficits. And it blew up because they didn't have that sort of no bailout clause. So now let's move to Bolivia, Colombia. In Colombia, you saw a much less dramatic and much less damaging, but broadly similar kind of dynamic, where President Samper in the late 1990s was politically weak. They decentralized, but they didn't roll back the central state. So they gave power and resources to municipalities in Colombia and to governorships, but they did not roll back the central state because the president wanted to be able to continue to exert patronage. And so the fiscal deficit got out of control, and Colombia had its first recession in 70 years. right? Colombia, by some measures, Colombia is not a star performer, but it's been incredibly consistent through the 20th century. And by some measures, it was the country that grew the best, as in the largest number of quarters of consecutive growth of any country in the world, including the richest countries. And they had their first recession because of decentralization in a very direct way. The Bolivians didn't, not because they're so brilliant or so wise, but because they were too poor. The central government could not decentralize authority and resources to municipalities without scaling back the central state, because there just wasn't enough money around. So they did that, and when they told the municipalities, well, actually they told most municipalities, you can't borrow, full stop. This was a legal requirement. You cannot borrow money. Also, the financial sector in Bolivia is far too underdeveloped for banks to be giving loans to municipalities. But also, they said very clearly, we're not going to bail you out. And if you think there's money here to cover your deficit, forget about it. And this was completely credible because the state was so poor. And so in that sense, sort of backwards sort of way, it worked.
So don't become too rich when you're decentralizing, right? Well, but let's talk about that, because the other issue, and this came through in a question, is local government revenues.
Yeah.
And we have several problems. I mean, one is sometimes the decentralization reduces the incentive to generate local government revenues, because there's this flypaper effect going on. And secondly, in very poor communities that don't have the capacity to generate their own revenues, basically decentralization is a wash, because still the central government controls what you can do, because they control the money that you get. So in what sense are they getting any decentralization?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's great. It's great that they would come onto this. I think it's enormously important for decentralization to set up legal powers for subnational governments to raise their own tax revenue, but also to set up dynamic incentives for them to develop their tax bases. So where money, now fiscal transfers, vertical fiscal transfers, of course, will be complex, and you'll have different transfers according to different criteria. But it's very important, in my view, for important transfers, for non-small fiscal transfers, to work on basis of matching grants, where you get more money as a mayor if you raise more money. So you raise, for every $1 you raise, then you get $5 or $10. Highly leveraged flows from the center. And if you don't raise that dollar, you don't get the 10. And so this develops a local tax base, and it also then dynamically influences how you invest, because you know that if you invest in this road, then all the factories, all the businesses that are along that road their property value will go up, and they can borrow more money, and they can invest to expand the factory, and then the revenues go up, and you can charge them more taxes. And so it works into a system that should affect public investment plans in a way that leads to more economic growth over time. And it's subtle, and it's quiet and operates behind the scenes, but it really does work.
What about? Well, let me tell you. I mean, this came up. I remember once looking at the decentralization in Sri Lanka, where there was a devolution plan, it was during the ethnic war. I mean, there was a civil war going on at the same time, and there was an agreement to devolve power to local governments in the Tamil areas, but that happened to be the poorer areas. So basically, the central government continued to control what could be done in the Tamil areas, because they had no local sources of revenue, and so this was their only source of revenue. And so by pulling the string or pushing you could basically continue to control. So there was no decentralization.
Yeah. I mean, I think that most countries that decentralize really do that, and really we should call these places more deconcentrations than decentralizations. I'll talk a little bit about Colombia. The data is sufficiently good that you can discriminate between municipalities in the same time period under the same decentralization program that are relatively more versus less decentralized, in the sense that the local governments have more discretion in the use of funds. And we have this in two separate measures. One is where their investment for health, education, water and sanitation, transport are funded more out of their own resources over which they have free disposal. So it's their own taxes that they can do whatever they want with. Or where they come through central transfers, and then we have two separate kinds of central transfers. Central transfers that come with strings attached. This is money for health, which must be invested in this way. Or this is money that you can invest however you want, but you do have to tell us what you did. So you have then three different layers of freedom or discretion on the part of mayors. Their own money, they can do anything they want with, and they report, they're accountable electorally in the normal way. Central transfers where they have a little bit of accountability but not much, and then central transfers that are strongly tied. And those municipalities that are more decentralized and using money over which they have more control get systematically better results. And this really shocked us when we were doing this with my colleague Fabio Sanchez of Los Andes in Bogota. What we were hoping for when we ran these regressions was that we would show that own resources led to better outcomes in terms of more schooling and higher enrollment rates and this kind of thing, sort of output or even outcome measures in the different sectors. And we were hoping that the coefficients would be larger than the coefficients on centrally tied funds, right? So that we would have an argument. We thought in the best case, the coefficients on centrally tied funds would be not statistically significant. They're actually negative, right? So where the central government is where education, just to stick to one example, is being financed mainly from central funds which are highly tied, you get a decrease in the enrollment bonus that decentralization provided, whereas where in similar municipalities with similar characteristics, where the money comes from own resources or untied funds, they get a bigger increase in enrollment gains. So
I'd add that some of those central government funds were probably World Bank loans.
Yeah, well, yeah, of both types, maybe. I don't know. So yeah, I mean, decentralization means that you hand money over to people and you let them do what they will with it. And I don't expect that any decentralizing government will hand all the money over and say, best of luck to you. You'll always have two kinds of streams. But if you haven't got the untied stream, then you haven't got decentralization.
This is an interesting question because it's a topic that we've circled around. So one of the issues is that there's already several layers of more or less decentralized powers. So deepening decentralization should involve simplification. Do you know successful examples where decentralization has also achieved simplification? This contradicts your earlier point about disruption and
complexification. No, the simple answer, no, I don't know of any. I can imagine, I know anecdotally of some countries where you have highly complex and obscure and untransparent centralized systems, and a good decentralization would, among other things, also have some side benefits, which would be simplification and greater transparency. But I can't speak with any authority on that.
Does a small country still need decentralization?
How small? I say I'm a true believer because I'm a true believer in democratic participation, and there will always be some sorts of services that are sufficiently local and sufficiently small scale with low economies of scale that they can be organized at the community level. So, even in a place like Singapore, you'll have, sub-city sort of areas of responsibility that should be concerned with, trash collection or public lighting or something along those lines. But admittedly, bigger countries that are more diverse need more of it.
No, but there you're slipping back into the Musgrave Oates. I mean, there you're using standard public economics to say there's a case for decentralization. But I actually think, I mean, my sense, again, coming from Sri Lanka, a small country with deep ethnic divisions, that if you can have ethnic cleavages in very small countries, in which case there might be a case for decentralization, as we were discussing, regardless of the size.
Yeah, I think Sri Lanka seems to be like an obvious case where you have to. There's no way that I can see going forward the country will survive as a country without some level of decentralization. There's a very personal view. I'm not saying it with any authority, but it's just my opinion.
But what about a country?
Sorry, let me just before we. I don't want to associate decentralization with ethnic cleavages in a necessary way. I think that there are countries and particular problems with particular histories where decentralization can get around an ethnic problem. But so the U.S. is a highly ethnically heterogeneous country, and it is also a highly decentralized country, but it's not decentralized along ethnic lines, and I don't think it should be. So I would never say we should reorganize federalism in the U.S. to take account of different ethnic groups. I think that would be absurd. I think part of the benefit of decentralization in a country that has ethnic cleavages that are politically salient, that might be behind violent movements, so on and so forth. The decentralization can help to take the ethnic poison out of the system and help to create nation states where you have a sense of identity that is not ethnic, that is above the ethnic cleavage. In countries where you already have that, then you should let it lie and focus on the Musgrave votes and other things like service delivery.
Okay. We're winding down here, Jean-Paul. But there's a question that's come up 2 or 3 times. And there's something on my mind as well. But let me give you the concrete example. Romania is looking at decentralizing health and education. What 3 principles do you suggest they follow?
I know very little about Romania, so I'm very, very hesitant to give any kind of advice to a particular country that I don't know well.
Take Bangladesh then. I mean, you know Bangladesh a little bit. You've been working there, or
no? Well, let's just stick to Romania. Just so I'm still jet lagged, so I can't think about 2 countries at once. I would say the Musgrave votes, kinds of things that have to do with spillovers and economies of scale. Yeah, but the other thing I would say, and I'm assuming from what little I know that Romania, I mean, obviously in its communist past, it wasn't a highly decentralized place, and I assume it hasn't become so since then. So I would say simplicity and transparency to begin with, and then to make that decentralization more complex and to take account of more especially economic factors in terms of unit costs of service provision or poverty indices or something like that later on. But in the beginning, to make it work and to make it credible, then transparency and simplicity are really very important. And let decentralization, because as we said earlier on, it's a process, and the process will take at least a generation, if not longer. It's not a flip you switch where you get it right the first time and you do it and you're done. So start off decentralizing to reasonable administrative levels in a democratic way with locally elected politicians, locally elected public servants, and make it simple and make it very clear what it is that you're doing. The Bolivians did this. The reason that you had peasants demanding their pots of money to build schools in their villages with 300 people is that there was a huge public relations campaign that said 155 Bolivianos per capita. This is every Bolivian's right.
So maybe let me suggest that, because we go back and forth. You've been talking about complexification and coined the phrase, and at the same time, when asked for advice, you say, "Let's keep it simple." Is there a way to reconcile those two?
Yeah, I think so. I'm an academic, so I'm speaking out both sides of my mouth. This is my right. This is why I don't have a real job, unlike all of you. It's complex. It's really complex in the long term. It's not complex in the beginning in any country that's de novo decentralizing, because it needs to be credible and because the politics side of it is more important than the economic side. And so the way that people interact with decentralization and the way that they see their public servants to be responsive to them or not is really very crucial. And so to the extent that it's simpler, it's better. But if we're moving, when I say complexification, speaking as an academic, we talk about moving from a polar extreme of highly centralized government, which may be the case in Romania. It certainly would have been the case, immediately after Ceausescu. To decentralization means that the public administration has just become significantly more complex. And so my point about doing it in a way that's simple is don't overdo the increasing complexity of it in one go. Make it a gradual process.
No, I think that's a very nice way to conclude, which is decentralization is a complex process. It is a complexifying activity because of the politics, but maybe economists can help by keep making it simple along that complex process. When you have a chance to simplify, continue to simplify, because the complexity is there with you. You can't avoid it. Would that be
I agree completely.
Bottom line?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Well, this has been great, Jean-Paul. Thanks very much. I think we've learned quite a lot, and we had a very nice discussion. As I said, these questions, not all the questions came from me. They came from the audience here and overseas. So thanks very much for a very useful and productive discussion.
Well, thank you, Shanta. Thanks all of you. Thanks very much.
I have a few announcements before you leave the room. I have to do some spiel for Forum 2014. There's a wikithon on in the Preston, so if you've been inspired, do create a wiki page. Please also visit the Genius Bar and the Project Expo in the MC Atrium, and then personal stories from your colleagues at 4:30 in Preston. There will be evaluation forms at the door. Please fill in. It's just smiley, sad faces, so it's not going to take time. One announcement, my own, I have misplaced my black notebook, so if you find it, please leave it where it is. And everybody, thank you, Shanta and Jean-Paul, and the audience. Everybody have a fabulous day.
And Jean-Paul is doing a, what is it called?
Yeah.
Expert
on call in the library, where you can be face-to-face, one-to-one with him.
Thank you, Shanta. I went on too long.